So, I was really excited when our colleagues at Humanities Texas suggested this oral history in the classroom module. And one of the things that I was hoping we could do with this would be to allow for the creation of a cadre of teachers around the state who are interested in doing this, who can learn from each other, who can share best practices, who can cry on each other's shoulders. And so hopefully we're starting that tonight. I don't know how many of you attended the Zoom this summer. I think I recognize a couple of names and faces in here, but if you haven't, I hope you were able to at least watch that for the introduction that we provided. We're trying to move from the introduction to oral history to implementing oral history tonight. And I'm so excited that Liz can participate because she really has the experience of doing this on the ground in the classroom with middle school and high school teachers. I think that oral history as a tool has so many things that it can offer you and your students. It's not the perfect tool for every situation. You may find it very difficult to fit it into your calendar, but I also think it's a versatile enough tool that we can make it work for you. At least that's my hope. So hopefully we will get the ball farther down the field on that tonight. But just know that the first few times you do this, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn a lot. You're not going to do everything perfectly. And your students are not going to get everything out of it the first time that you had hoped they would. I guess what I'm really asking is that if you do commit to it, you just commit to intentionally learning from the mistakes that you make. That's how I've learned how to do this. I never took an oral history class in college or grad school, so I'm largely self-taught, and I'm mostly have learned from mistakes that I've made or from mistakes that colleagues have made. You'll find that oral historians really like to talk to each other and share those best practices. So you're entering a community of oral historians by committing to do this. And on behalf of that community, we're really happy to have you. Maybe we should start with any questions that came up from the summer meeting. Or from your experiences as you contemplate doing oral history. What questions do you have? That's a great first question. Has anyone implemented this practice in their classroom? Christian, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Christine.
Christine, I'm guessing from your question that you're thinking about starting, but you have not started, or have you?
I have not started, and I was just wondering if anybody had jumped in. We do have a project-based learning, like a project coming up. I did not include that in one of the products, but was thinking about possibly. It's a very specific project though on Native Americans, so sure.
All right. Anyone else? Well, maybe we should jump into, I'm going to share my screen here. Maybe we should jump into some basic oral history project planning things to consider. One of the things that I recommended in our summer meeting was that if you're really thinking about having I would recommend this anyway. But if you're thinking of having students record oral histories for an oral history project, build oral history into your teaching in more organic ways, so that you're finding interviews that you can use to teach subjects. Anytime you do a primary source exercise with your students, maybe pick an oral history interview or an excerpt of an interview that you can use to teach the civil rights movement or Vietnam or whatever you're teaching, so that you get them thinking about oral history as a source and interviewing as a practice, right? So you sort of build that into your teaching as a way of ramping up to thinking about starting a project. But I thought it would be helpful at this point just to share with you some of the questions that I ask myself when I start a new project, that I get my grad students to answer when they're starting a new project. And then I think we'll take a few minutes to break into groups to talk a little bit more specifically about some interviewing techniques, some interviewing best practices once you do get this started. But you'll find this in the Google Classroom. These are the sorts of questions you need to be asking as you prepare to do an oral history project with your students. What topics will your project cover? Is this something that you want to throw open in just the widest way possible and have them talk to a family member about anything, or a member of the community about anything? Or do you want everyone interviewing on the same subject? So, again, it could be the Vietnam War. It could be any number of wars that have come since then. It could be their experiences in civil rights organizing. It could be all sorts of things. You may have a unit on food history, something like that. So interviewing them about family food tradition, interviewing family members about food traditions, things like this. There are a million different ways that you could structure a project like this. But you need to figure out, obviously, on the front end, what sorts of topics you want your project to cover. You need to figure out how you want to record your interviews. And we talked in the summer meeting about some good technologies that are out there that allow students to do this on their cell phones. We mentioned the StoryCorps app as a good possibility. Just using the camera on a phone to record a video, of course, is also a possibility. There are also apps that allow you to record very high quality audio interviews with a cell phone. You may have other options available to you, but you need to figure that out on the front end, obviously. Are you going to archive your interviews either on the web or in the school library or with a community archiving partner? You don't necessarily need to do that, but if you are archiving it, it does tend to up the stakes a little bit for your students. When they think that they're doing something like this for posterity, they tend to put a little bit more into it. So again, the StoryCorps app is one of those possibilities that will take care of that for you if it's the choice that you want to make. You also need to figure out whether there's a partner in the community that you can work with to make this possible. It could be a local history organization. It could be a neighborhood association. Obviously, there are lots of possibilities out there, but I would strongly suggest that if you can find a partner in the community to help you do this, that you do it. When we try to train students how to be oral history interviewers, we're trying to get them to listen deeply. And when we do our exercise here in a few minutes, you'll see some listening exercises that I have adapted from other academics that are meant to help people build that skill of listening deeply before they actually go out and do interviews. So just know that when you're asking students to do this, this is what you're trying to help them build. You're trying to help them develop that deep listening skill. And boy, believe me, the tide is not moving in that direction in our culture. So by helping students develop those skills, I think you're really helping them with life skills that they may not be getting otherwise. So I consider that kind of a civic duty on top of everything else to, if we're helping students develop the skill of listening deeply, then we're helping them become more empathetic. And that's something I think we wish everyone would develop. That's something you can help your students develop with oral history skills. So for an individual interview, anytime I schedule an individual interview, I have already had conversations with myself about what my goals are for the interview, what kind of topics I want to make sure that we cover in the interview. Sometimes I'll use a prepared list of questions. Oftentimes my students will insist on using a prepared list of questions, but that's not something that you necessarily have to do. This is largely a matter of preference for interviewers. But know that if you do use a prepared list of questions when you do an interview, and this is something that I really harp on when I train my students, if you do use a prepared list of questions, I really want you to commit to diverging from your prepared list when it's necessary, right? The very best questions anyone ever asks in an oral history interview are follow-up questions. They're not the perfectly worded questions that they go in with. They're follow-up questions, and it can be something as simple as, what do you mean by that? Could you elaborate on that? Could you tell me more about that? Your goal in an oral history interview, as I see it, and there are lots of ways to define this, obviously, but the way I see it is I'm trying to facilitate someone telling their story in the fullest, richest, most nuanced way possible. And the way to do that is by listening really carefully to them and asking them to elaborate on things. Tell me more about this subject. What was that like when that happened to you? Those sorts of follow-up questions are what I'm getting at. So you certainly want to have a firm idea about your goals for the interview, the topics to be covered in the interview. You may have a prepared list of questions for the interview, but you really need to make sure that you're listening for follow-up questions. And you want to prepare an introduction for each interview. So you want to set the tone for each one. You'll go into it and you'll say, I'm Todd Moye. I'm from the University of North Texas. Today is October 30th, 2023, and I'm speaking over Zoom with Liz Close, who is an academic coach in the Austin Independent School District. Today, we're going to be talking about XYZ, whatever topics we have determined we're going to talk about in that interview. And that sets the tone for the interview. This is not just a chat. This is not just us bullshitting over Zoom. We are here to do something serious. And it also makes it easier to archive if you're going to archive it in the future. So you've conducted a successful interview. Afterwards, what's the appropriate way to thank your interviewees? Is it a handwritten note? Each student writes a handwritten note to their interviewee. Those would be very appreciated. It could take some other form. Thank you so much. Here's a copy of your interview, a digital copy or a physical copy of your interview. The thank you could take several different forms, but some sort of interview thank you is appropriate. I think it's important to have some sort of exercise in which interviewers can learn from their interviews. In my graduate seminar, we do that through peer critiques, but there are lots of forms that could take. There needs to be some sort of follow-up exercise where students learn from the experience. And then you have to make some final decisions about the final form that the interviews will take. It could be a group archive. It could be a website in which students interpret the historical significance of what has come up in their interviews. It could be a pop-up museum exhibit. It could be something much less fancy than any of those options. But you need to have some sort of final form, depending on the age group of the students that you're working with. You may decide that the only thing you want your students to get out of this is the experience of sitting down and having a serious conversation with an older person, with a 50-year-old, an ancient person. And that may be age appropriate for the students that you teach. That may be the final form of your interviewing project. But if you're working with high school students, they're capable of much more than that. So give some thought as to what your final form will take. Again, Liz and I have both recommended the StoryCorps app for these kinds of uses. And the StoryCorps app automatically archives a digital copy of the interview recording at the Library of Congress. So it takes care a lot of, it checks off a lot of the boxes that I'm talking about for project planning questions, but it's not the only game in town. It's the one that I've used in the past. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's pretty good. So let's talk about how we prepare students to listen deeply. I've prepared some listening exercises that you can find in your Google Classroom. Again, these are very adaptable. I've adapted them myself from an academic article that was written by Martha Norkunis, formerly of UT Austin, but who's now at Middle Tennessee State University. All of these may not be appropriate for the grade level that you teach, but you'll find a way to adapt them. What we're getting at is we're just trying to help students figure out how to ask open-ended questions, questions that don't have yes or no answers, trying to get them prepared to listen deeply for the follow-up question that they need to be asking. It's also going to be necessary to do a little bit of extra teaching on whatever subject you're having your students interview about, right? So that they'll have more context for the interview and help them ask better questions. Kamiko, we have such a small group today. Maybe we can just break into two groups. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, I think we can just break into two groups. Am I right? That'll be about 5 per group.
Yes, that should be about 5 per group.
5 teachers per group. Why don't we do this? And I'm going to ask each of you to, in your small group, have a conversation around the first listening exercise. So we all have the media that we consume, and we all have people who we think are good interviewers from that media. So I'd like you to have a conversation in your small group about what makes that interviewer a good interviewer. What kinds of tips can you pick up from that interviewer, and how can you then use that for your own oral history project that you're contemplating, and how might you use things that you've learned from that interviewer to help your students develop the deep listening skills that we're trying to help them. I was just telling group number 1 that I do think it's important that you have students practice with each other, adapt the listening exercises that I've provided, and come up with ones that will make sense for your students. I've showed you some that make sense for my grad students, but they're not age appropriate for your students necessarily. But I do think it's important to give them those small stakes, scaffolded exercises to prepare them for actually interviewing. Group number 1 had some good points to make about preparation as well that I'll share with group 2, because we didn't talk about that while I was in that group. The more opportunities you can give the students to research whatever topic they're going to be interviewing about, the better the experience is going to be for the interviewee especially, but it'll be better for the student as well. All right, hopefully that gives you some ideas of how you can train students to do oral history when you get to this. I think we're turning it over to Liz now for talk about implementation of projects.
All right, sounds good. Thank you very much, Todd, and thank you to the groups that I popped into and got to share a bit with. Bear with me, everyone. I was mentioning in the second group that presenting on Zoom again, even though it's something I did every day for so many years, it just kind of gives me like a weird flashback and I forget how to do stuff. So bear with me. And I think we'll get through it. Let's see. Can we all see my screen? Wonderful. All right, so let's talk about the implementation piece. My hope is that you can walk away with something in theory that you can either steal as is or adapt. Why does Siri think I'm talking to it? Sorry. So hopefully you can adapt these materials, and this really is sort of a crash course version of the product for the project. For those of you who are worried about time crunch or just having something that's sort of accessible to students right away, I think that this version might be helpful to you. Okay. And again, I taught 8 years, which isn't forever, but I did some version of this project for 5 of them, I believe. So, and it was something that once I kind of got my footing, I think Todd mentioned earlier, like the failures, you learn from moments of what works and what doesn't work. But pretty quickly, I felt a good grasp of what can work in a secondary classroom. I know we're only going to do 1 minute, but I very much believe in the 3 SEL signature practices to like get people just, I don't know, on the same page. So take 1 minute in the chat, if you will. How do you remember first listening to music?
On a record player.
Very good. Very cool. They're hip. They're back in now.
Oh, good. I'm glad. On a jukebox.
Awesome. I went to an old school dance hall over this past weekend out in the hill country. They had both, well, there's a stage and there was a jukebox, which is cool. Playing records on a tape, little recorder, on cassette. Todd, this one's for you. I walked into a classroom once. It wasn't a classroom of my students. And I'm a very tattooed person. If you haven't all noticed that, don't hold it against me. But I had a shiny one right here on the back of my arm that is a cassette tape. And I walk in and a student just says, "Hey, look at that thing on her arm. It's one of those things from Guardians of the Galaxy." And I almost died. So if anyone, can relate to that, I was like, oh, good. I'm 112 years old and here we are and moving on. So Blondie tape, super cool memory, cartoons, CDs. Awesome. Okay. I just always find that question gives me warm feelings. So hopefully it did for you as well. Okay. So this was actually, and I adapted part of this from Todd's presentation last time, right? There's sort of 2 avenues for using oral histories in the classroom. There's the utilization piece, which I would do. And let me also state, I used this primarily in my ethnic studies class, which was an elective, and it was an honors level elective, but I got the whole gamut of students, right? It was 9 through 12. And I remember the counselors being like, you shouldn't let 9th graders in this class. And I'm like, oh, give them to me. Right? I want it all, right? And so it was interesting, but we would use, I'm trying to think. Actually, when we were learning about the Black Panthers, and I was trying to find a way to bring in women's voices, right? Because that's not typically, if you're reading a book about the Black Panthers or reading an excerpt, that's not something you're going to get. And so there are recorded interviews of women who were part of the Black Panther Party. And so I said, hey, here's 6 of them that I'm posting for you. Pick one, and you're going to listen to 15 minutes of it, sort of giving them the choice. So I did do the utilizing, but I am going to focus on the creating piece. And again, I used the StoryCorps app just because I like something that I can take ready-made. So just a reminder, right, when you're creating the oral histories, there's so many different types of projects. People mentioned the preparation, and especially if you're doing something around academic research, if you're doing something around like interviewing people who are involved in a civil rights movement or something specific, that is a thing. But there can also be something that's more like a personal narrative or a memoir or a family history. So a lot of avenues, okay? Also, I just think there's something really cool. It's a good opportunity for students to explore their own identity. And I mean, again, I was a social studies teacher. I live in the humanities world. I believe in growing the empathy, like Todd also mentioned, but I don't know. I think it's a cool place for kids to think about themselves, their own positionality, and how to connect with others. And then lastly, at least the version of this project that I like to do, I think it can give kids a really powerful moment to connect more with their own community, their family, or their culture. Okay, so when I snap my fingers, you are going to be transported into Miss Close's ethnic studies class briefly, and you will be my students. And that's what we're going to do. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Kamiko, thank you for putting your phone away. Just kidding. We are going to take a look at 2 very short videos, okay? And what these are animated excerpts of a larger interview that took place. They're less than 2 minutes a piece. So I will ask you to, as you are listening and watching, there are some questions there at the bottom, which I could also put in the chat, but I'd like you to think about what is special about these stories. How do you think it feels to have your history or memories recorded forever? And how might this project help you feel better connected to this classroom? Okay, so. All right, I hope you enjoyed that first piece. I like to, really kind of grab people's attention with the humor, at least with the youth, because they would be like, ooh, it sounded like they were saying a bad word, but they weren't because they were talking about something else, right? So again, thinking about those questions, what do you think is special? How do you think it feels to have your history recorded? Feel free as you're watching to drop some answers into the chat if you'd like. Otherwise, I'll ask if anyone wants to share out. Second video. I did want to say, right, and that one is always, I find that one charming, but it hits. Like there are some moments in there that really hit with students. And I meant to say about the first video as well. I don't know any teacher in Texas who, is getting less emerging bilinguals in their classroom, right? It is a diverse population, but we have so many Spanish speaking students in our schools. And I would show this video, and the number of students that still have something that resonates with them in regards to their name or their name being changed, or I had Vietnamese students who were like, oh yeah, well my name on here says Anne or this or whatever, but really my name is X. We just wanted to avoid complications, right? And so there is something that still kind of resounds with students in hearing some of these clips here. So let's take a moment. If you feel so inclined, I will be quiet for a solid minute. And if you'd like to share out with one of these questions, actually, I'm going to go into present mode again. And sorry. There we go. Feel free to unmute or to drop some of your responses in the chat.
I like the first story. I mean, I like both of them, but the first story I think reminds me of, I bet that person felt good remembering. Like it just feels good sometimes to tell smaller details. Like this wasn't their experience of, their immigration story or anything like that, it was a small thing of this person coming, but a big thing, like you said. And I do think, like, when I talk with people and have really nice conversations, especially older people, a lot of the time, I just really like these details. And I think people get that like gleam in their eye sometimes when they're just talking about something that seems special, like something small.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Christine. And I saw some comments in the chat about that one as well. And it's like a slice of life, small story that seems right. It does, you chuckle with it, but you also realize like there was this moment of real empowerment where kids were like, aha, that guy's name didn't get changed. And it has mattered to all of us that our names got changed, right? And that has been something that, on whatever level we've internalized. So it's almost this like, this victory moment in something that does matter, but is told in a way that is, relatable. And sometimes, as people have these interviews and they tell these stories, it's really serious topics can come out in very different ways, but yeah, done. Yeah. So anyone else wanted to share?
I'm interested if people have thoughts about Liz's question, how does it feel to have your history or memories recorded? What would be your guess about how interviewees feel about this?
I'm just going to talk because my typing's not fast enough. I would think that if somebody is being recorded, that having just somebody taking the time to stop and visit with you and, think that you have value. Because a lot of times, especially in our generation, our older generations, they sometimes feel that they're past of the value and the younger ones just kind of push them to the side and move on. And having somebody stop and talk and maybe say, hey, what was it like when you were going to school? Or did you have good times? Or tell us something that happened. I really think that it just gives them a feeling of importance to have some part of their lives recorded and maybe archived.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, as Todd had mentioned earlier, right, one of the options, if you are using the StoryCorps app, is to upload the interview into the Library of Congress. And that really does, like, it for students and for the people they're interviewing, that gives it weight, right? And yeah, again, with students, I found short videos that kind of hit on a number of different emotions, and you laugh a little and you think a little. It's just a really good entry point, right? A really good sort of a hook, right? As we call it. And sometimes, we need that. So yeah. And yeah, Christine, the illustration option, I mean, like that, when I showed these to the students, they're like, are we going to make those? And I'm like, do you know how to make those? Like, sure, like go for it, please. Are you an expert in? But there were some students who actually did ask, right? Because we would do a written reflection afterwards and they would say like, I want to create a visual thing as well. Like, can I draw something? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. Like, of course you can do that. So, okay. I forgot it's gonna start the videos. Okay, and just as like a last little thought piece before we look at did I? No, okay. Before we look at a few more things, and again, I have some handouts and some like of the like piece by piece things that we used, but I really also like this idea of the funds of knowledge, right? Which I actually, Kimiko, grad school, I wrote that in there. It's this idea, right, that not all knowledge comes from the same place. And we do live in a society where like a very specific type of knowledge is typically valued, right? So I think that this can just be something like an oral history, especially collecting an oral history from someone's specific family or culture or community, can really give them an opportunity to say, hey, I have some historically accumulated and culturally developed, bodies of knowledge and skills that do matter. And maybe I don't get a chance to always show that in typical school. And this is possibly a way for students to do that. So hopefully we can tap into that with this project. Okay, so here is what we are going to do with the rest of our time. What time is it? Oh, we're good. Okay, so when were we going to start questions? Kimiko, was that at 6:10?
I believe 6:10 or 6:15 around
Okay.
there.
So how about this then? Let's do, instead of, I wrote 7 minutes, let's do 5 minutes. If you were able to just open those breakout rooms again. And what I'm gonna ask you all to do, again, as my students, even though I went in and out of that, sorry, I didn't commit to the bit. We're gonna look at this one pager, and I'm gonna drop, I'm gonna drop the link to that in the chat, to look at this one first. Dun, dun, dun. So take 5 minutes, if you would be so kind. Did that work? There we go. And what it looks like is this. Okay, this was the actual, I used this handout on day 1, and it actually is 3 short excerpts. And again, I had a lot of students that were emerging bilingual. I had a lot of students that were special, that had special needs and wanted to take this class. And I was like, we'll make it work for everybody. So there is 1, 2, 3 short excerpts, and we're going to pretend you're in a gallery walk around my room where I have this reading chunked, because the world, that's the good way to do it. And then there are some discussion questions at the end. You might not get to them, but if you did, for example, I have here, what I would do is I would do a think, write, pair, share with the students, but I'm going to stop sharing. All right, welcome back, everybody. And the thing I forgot to mention, sorry, on the front end of that one pager is that we had just, in my ethnic studies class, we had just done an academic unit. We'd done African American studies, and we were in the middle of Indigenous studies. So those readings really played into both some previous learning and making connections to the content that we were currently using. I am dropping into the chat. These are all in the Google Classroom, so don't be like, oh, wall of links. But if you want to follow along with me, these are the 4 documents I'm going to show you. So the first one was what we just looked at, which was sort of the day 1 reading and discussion questions. This is what, for those of you looking for like the real practicality piece, what might interest you the most. Here is my schedule for how I conducted this project in 4 days. And I would love the space to, you can make this project as long as you want. This is my version for those of you that feel time crunched, or you're in a tested subject or whatever. This is how you can do it. Okay. And I also did this only once in this cross collaborative structure here. It says social studies and ELAR. Most of the years I did it, like 4 years, I did do it just in social studies class. Okay, so I was able to kind of crunch everything together. So as you can see here, day 1, that what is oral history handout, that's what we just looked at. I would use that to sort of preview, kind of get into their knowledge of what is it, right? There's also a facing history lesson that I have linked here. And even when I didn't pair with the English class, we would do like an identity chart or an identity wheel and talk about sort of our own worldviews and like kind of what our positionality is on that first day. Day 2, this handout here, which I also have for you here. This was my warm-up, and this is actually the StoryCorps mission, which I find really beautiful. Please read it on your own time. But right, this idea of building connections between people to create a more just and compassionate world is in my brain, the humanities in a nutshell. The videos are linked here, as well as the questions. So there was like an activity. And then this was sort of what I would post is like, here is the sort of the intro to the project. And again, I did this as the Great Thanksgiving Listen, which is the StoryCorps specific project. I have the folder linked here for all the handouts that I did use from their website, if that interests you. But I timed this, and I timed these 4 days in the week before Thanksgiving. And I understand there's kind of pros and cons to that. I didn't like assigning something necessarily over Thanksgiving, but the idea was that these 4 days, or sorry, these 3 days, actually 3 days of prep time, and this was a block schedule, so 90-minute periods, would be spent preparing for the interview, right? Picking out who they were going to interview in either their family or community, and doing some work on the front end, such as watching those videos, doing a basic partner interview, which I have a handout here. I think Todd's questions and preparation are much more sound in thinking about how you want to organize that. Okay. I also had students draft and write out a short personal narrative themselves, where so they were kind of asking themselves their own interview questions, and then they had to record themselves, which was very funny. But, you know, and some kids kind of gave some really sort of surface level things about like, here's when I started playing baseball. But some kids really like opened up about some deeply personal things. So this is how you can do that. And then the only thing that they do is you say, hey, you have the app downloaded on your phone, you have done a practice interview. I have, in theory, and I do think this part's important, had a one-on-one conversation with you about the intentional ordering of your questions, seeing what you're going to do, making sure your questions are not yes or no questions. You're going to sit down with somebody that you've asked ahead of time over this week-long break. And we have a week off in Austin ISD. I'm so sorry if those of you that don't. And you're going to have at least a 30-minute conversation. Did most people end up having an hour to an hour and a half? Yes, most teenagers did, at least from my classroom. So, and then the day we came back, they would sort of troubleshoot any uploading issues with the app. And we usually did like a circle reflection where kids talked about some aspects of their interview together. And then they also did a written reflection where they sort of were able to think about what went well, what didn't go well, you know, what was the most impactful part of the interview process for you. And I did have a lot of students, I encouraged them to interview older family members, which I have a caveat about that, but and sometimes kids would say, hey, sorry, my grandma only speaks Korean. And I was like, great, do your interview in Korean. That sounds awesome. Like, do it. And they're like, are you going to listen to it? And I'm like, yeah, I will listen to a portion of it. And I will hear your voices and I will hear your tone. And in your written reflection, you will explain to me what you talked about, right? So there's a way to do it, you know, to still kind of honor that identity and what kids want to do. And so also I do believe, again, in sort of a one-on-one moment with students, because again, this would be November, a couple weeks if you want to do it. And I'd like to think you know your kids pretty well by then, and you might know, hey, Liz might not have someone that she wants to talk to this week. She might not look forward to going home for a week. You know, maybe being at school is her safe space. And there is a moment to sort of honor that, have that discussion with students individually, or to say, hey, you know, the idea is hopefully you're going to be able to talk to a family member. If I'm the most trusted adult, you know, we'll schedule a lunch interview next week, right? And I always did at least 2 interviews per project. So that is this is the schedule. Again, here is sort of this document here. This is just a really brief introduction. I do think you have to kind of think out your own project steps and what you expect them, what the expectations are. And then here is a partner activity as well as reflection questions for day 3. And again, these handouts, I'm kind of going through it fast now, but these do all kind of go along days 1 through 4. And I think that's all I have to say. And I have questions, or sorry, if you have questions, please, 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 now is the time.
Can I just really quickly underline, do not skip the reflections. I think that part is so important.
Do you have the kids listen to each other's interviews as part of that reflection process?
It's a good question. I did not. And only because 1, time, and 2, more students than they like more kids than they even expected ended up getting into some pretty deep things with family members that they didn't necessarily think about, right? Like to Todd's point of like, you have your questions. And again, one of their assignments is I'm looking at their questions, a peer is looking at their questions, they are getting them sort of reviewed. But you know how many kids would get to question 4 and be like, I'm taking a pathway, you know, asking those follow-up questions. That was brilliant. And they'd be like, I didn't expect it to happen. It was awesome, right? But, you know, they'll follow sort of different things. And I instead let them do their so they would do their written reflection first, and then they'd kind of have that to reference as we did a circle discussion, right? Where we would even, I believe in the protocol, pass the talking piece. What was something you want to say about your interview? What was something you didn't expect? And then they are choosing what pieces of it they want to share, or maybe it's none of them. But I did also, to hold them accountable, I did say, I'm at least going to listen to an excerpt of your interview. And I did, I would, not again, for the sake of time, not a ton, but I would listen to some.
I was thinking about something related to that, and I think we talked about this in the summer, and just that it's hard for adults. So I think it'd be hard for students, like how to handle things that might be traumatic or personal, and like sometimes you might want to go there because that's what they want to talk about, and then sometimes you might want to, I guess it said something about reading body language, right? Earlier, one of the questions. So that might be something you have to get the kids understanding, like body language might let you know that that subject is too difficult at that moment in time for a person to talk about. But I mean, I think the point is to make a human connection and as personal as they're willing to go, but without upsetting them, like I think.
You're right about that. Unfortunately, not all human connections are positive. That's a good reason to have students interview family members. At least you're kind of shrinking the universe of what people could possibly talk about. You know, the students know that there are some things you don't talk about in your family, and hopefully they wouldn't ask questions that have to do that. Even more so, hopefully interviewees would know there are things not to talk about with this student. Liz, I'm sure you have some practical advice about this that you've come up with.
I mean, again, so I would say, I mean, I've been party to hundreds and hundreds of these interviews at this point, and I've had, you know, and again, anything obviously can happen. I've had students go deep. I've had students, you know, I've had students cry, like, you know, in the end, like with, you know, with him. But it for the most part always was from a positive place. And we didn't, again, the thing you're talking about can absolutely happen. I didn't experience that much. And again, I think if you're going in, again, you're doing that preparation, you're talking about sort of, again, looking at their questions ahead of time, getting a flavor for what their interview is like. And when you do your one-on-one, I'm like, okay, cool, you're interviewing your grandpa, like, what's he like? And they're like, oh, like, you know, a Nazi sympathizer. And I'm like, I don't really want to hear what he has to say. Can we pick someone else? You know, like, and you can direct student, and that didn't actually happen, but like, you can get a flavor for understanding what this type of conversation would be like. Or if a kid's like, I want to talk, you know, I'm going to interview my dad, but like, we don't talk. It's like, well, okay, you probably, yeah, you guys should talk. Is this the moment for this interview? I don't know. So you just kind of got to do your best with that. But
when you're in a situation where adults are interviewing other adults, which is the case with, you know, my grad student projects, the best practice is that you have a pretty detailed pre-interview. You know, you talk about the topics that you want to discuss in the interview. That may or may not be possible for a student project like this, but if there's a way to work that into your training or into your workflow, you know, you need to have at least a 15-minute conversation with this person X number of days before you record the interview, something like that. That could go a long way.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, they do need to let the person know ahead of time, right? It's not like, surprise, like whoever, we're going to talk. And I do tend to mention, if you think you're going to be going into things, or if you think maybe this person is going to struggle with these conversations, or if you're like, you know, as I'm previewing questions, I might be like, how does this person feel about, you know, this thing in their childhood that you said is difficult? Like, maybe think about asking them if that's something they're going to want to talk about ahead of time. And it can just be as simple as that.
I was going to ask too about your 90-minute classes. Were you covering other things during that 90 minutes, or because I have 45 minutes, so I'm wondering, would this be 2 weeks before, or did that 90 minutes not cover all the things that you had to do in that lesson plan?
I would say because it was for I think you can crunch the activities. I tended to give kids a bunch of time, like, because I was like, this is the week before Thanksgiving. We're all feeling a little loose. I'm going to give you 30 minutes to like think about questions, write it down, download the app, whatever. Could that be 15? Absolutely. And a lot of times too, I will say like there was a 90-minute block and I'd be like, awesome, we actually finished. We have 20 minutes left. Everyone like take out your like interactive journals because I know none of you finished your thing from last week. Right? And like, so the time can be flexible. And I think, and again, like, and especially in a middle school setting, I really am a supporter of 45-minute classes for middle school.
My gosh, yes, you and me both. Like sometimes I can't even believe I do it. Like
I think you
sometimes.
can pick and choose, and I think you can prioritize. Like, I think you can look through all those materials and think about, if I still want to do this in a week, or maybe like a week and a half, what are the pieces I want to prioritize?
I have a question if I can jump in too. How much do you guide students to think about historical contexts or events or like major phenomena? And do you do that in kind of that preloading phase that Todd was just mentioning, or is that more that comes out of their reflection, or maybe not as much at all?
At least for this project, I had some students that wanted to go into something historical or something like a specific topic or something, and so they'd say like, hey, like I know my grandma like grew up in Mississippi and like we've never talked about it. And I want to talk to her about desegregation and I want to, do whatever. And I'd be like, okay, great. Like let's look into some things ahead of time and focus on that. But again, I guess just because I wanted kids to have a practice run at just kind of what this experience was like, I kept it pretty open in terms of like, focus on the thing that you think you want to talk about. And in the materials, like Todd had mentioned, there is like a questions list that I actually think is pretty good. It has categories like questions about family, questions about this, questions about whatever. Kids would sometimes be like, I feel more comfortable like just picking a section and kind of writing some of my own, but using these. But for this project, I didn't do that. I definitely think there's a way to do that, especially in a history specific class, which a lot of you might have, whether it's US history or Texas history or whatever. I think there's a way to gear students towards something based on content, and really then try to talk to people in their lives about those experiences. That becomes hard, right? Because there is time and it's like, when were you alive? But there's a way to do it for sure.
Yeah. And, some students will just sort of gravitate towards that because it's the low hanging fruit. How did you feel when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? And then what did you think about the Vietnam War? And then they'll go through and ask about the things that they have just learned about in this class. And that's not a bad thing. It might not be the interview that I would do, but that's not a bad thing at all.
All right.
And I'm going to put my email in the chat, even though it might be with everything else. But if anyone is like, hey, do you, I'm specifically thinking about this for this class and how would you maybe time it out? You're welcome to send me an email and I can try to help you think through that. Again, just for something specific to like, a 45-minute period, middle school, high school. I think still like the broader questions, go to Todd. And again, mine was really a very specific type of project, but I think you can adapt it. Is that my email? Nope, that's not right. There we go.
I'm very interested in hearing how this goes for y'all.